Hello, my name is Lewis Russell, President and CEO of APC. Thank you for taking time to review our video. An extensive epidemiological investigation was initiated following the 2014 Canadian PED outbreak. The results of the investigation were published in a series of papers. In fact, these papers are commonly cited when discussing the risk of spreading disease through feed and feed ingredients. Considering all that's been learned about PED, it's appropriate to review the original epidemiology to determine if all risk factors were appropriately considered. In fact, upon closer examination, it becomes apparent that several risk factors were not included in the original epidemiology. And if they had been included, the conclusions may have been different. Following the first reported PED case in Canada, government, university, and private epidemiologists began an investigation to determine how PED was introduced and spread. Aubrey and others summarized the work and concluded that the evidence supports an association with feed containing spray-dried porcine plasma contaminated with PED. In retrospect, other factors not included in the epidemiology likely contributed to the PED outbreak in eastern Canada. The following slides highlight the timeline of the first occurrence of PED in North America and early reports of PED in Canada. PED was first reported in the U.S. in May of 2013. On January 21, 2014, a positive PED environmental sample was reported at a Quebec abattoir. The next day, January 22, the index case was identified in southern Ontario. 2 days later, on January 24th, the epidemiology team reported all 10 environmental samples collected at an Ontario assembly yard were PED positive. The original epidemiology did not consider geographic distribution or the timeline of environmental contamination. If you consider the extent of environmental contamination in Canada, it's likely that PED was present prior to the index case, and therefore the index case does not represent the introduction of PED into Canada. This leads us to the next question. If the index case did not represent the introduction of PED into Canada, where could the virus have come from? CFIA regulations in place at the time of the outbreak required that trucks transporting livestock to the United States should be disinfected before returning to Canada. However, there was an exception to this regulation. If the trucks delivered pigs to a federally inspected abattoir and returned directly to Canada, the truck was only required to remove visible manure with a broom and shovel. Current PED practices involve multi-step cleaning protocols, including cleaning, washing with soap and hot water, disinfecting, and drying. As we can see, these protocols are much more extensive than the CFIA regulations in place at the time of the PED outbreak. In 2014, trucks were transporting pigs daily from Ontario to abattoirs in the U.S. Some of the trucks returning from U.S. abattoirs may not have been thoroughly disinfected and therefore could have brought PED into Canada, leading to contamination at the assembly yard, the abattoir, and other sites. The original epidemiology did not consider trucks returning from U.S. abattoirs as a PED risk. When considering the timeline and extent of environmental contamination from southern Ontario to Quebec, PED was likely present and being spread in Canada prior to the index case. Currently, it's recognized that direct animal contact with a PED contaminated site represents a high risk for spreading the virus. The 2014 epidemiology did not include a thorough assessment of animal movement. For example, 8 of the initial 25 PED positive farms had direct contact with the contaminated assembly yard within 2 weeks of the outbreak. However, tracing activities were not performed at the assembly yard. With what we know now about PED, contact with a contaminated site would be recognized as a high risk and thoroughly investigated. In retrospect, it's unfortunate that this risk factor was not studied in greater detail. It is likely that contact with the contaminated assembly yard contributed to the spread of PED. The fact that this risk factor was not considered by the epidemiologist does not preclude its contribution to the spread of PED. To determine if an ingredient is safe to include in animal feed, the manufacturing process must be validated to inactivate potential pathogens, and the process must be sufficiently controlled to prevent failures. The FDA collected retained samples and reviewed production records of the lot of plasma being investigated in Canada. Using pig bioassays, the FDA did not detect infective PED in the retained samples. In addition, after reviewing production records, the FDA could not find any breach in good manufacturing practices. There is no evidence to support the suggestion by the epidemiology team that a breach in GMPs resulted in PED contamination. So let's take a step back and review what we know. We know that the FDA did not detect infective PED in the manufacturer's retained sample, and it's important to recognize that the sample was not stored in a temperature-controlled laboratory. It was stored in the same warehouse as the lot of plasma under investigation. This leads us to the question, how did the CFIA sample become contaminated? One possible explanation is that multiple sampling resulted in contamination. In actuality, the plasma remaining at the feed manufacturer was sampled multiple times by two different groups before CFIA collected their sample. Multiple sampling creates the opportunity for contamination. I think everyone will agree that hindsight is 20/20. Since the original PED outbreak occurred, much has been learned about the risk factors associated with the introduction and spread of the virus. It is appropriate to reevaluate the epidemiology from the 2014 Canadian outbreak and assess if the conclusions are still valid. In retrospect, some of the conclusions from the original investigation may not be valid. For example, it is likely that the index case does not represent the introduction of PED into Canada. In addition, it's likely that trucks returning from U.S. abattoirs contributed to the introduction of PED into Canada. Animal movement in contact with the assembly yard likely contributed to the spread of PED. And it's possible that multiple sampling of the bags of plasma resulted in contamination of the sample tested by CFIA. In conclusion, with current knowledge about the spread and management of PED, there are a number of risk factors that should have been more thoroughly investigated. If these factors had been more thoroughly investigated, the conclusion from the original 2014 epidemiology may be different. For a more complete discussion, I encourage you to read the completed paper. It was published in Transboundary and Emerging Diseases in January 2020. At APC, we're committed to manufacturing safe and effective spray-dried blood products. We continue to lead the industry in research and invest in new technology, introducing a multiple hurdle approach in our manufacturing process. I invite you to visit our website to learn more. Thank you for your time and attention.